Welcome to another wonderful Susanna Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susanna Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. A Mama for Aimee. Chapter 1. On June 7, sup, year of our Lord 1872, Jordan Tate opened the door to the sheriff's office, moving as silently as possible. Hesitantly, he slipped into the building, craning his neck to scan around the door and see what waited for him on the other side. The heat of the summer day beat down on his neck, and the thin shake walls of the outpost did little to keep it any cooler inside. In the heat and quiet, the unsuspecting deputy slumbered at his desk. Jordan grinned to himself. It was only through sheer force of will that he restrained himself from rubbing his hands together in glee. It was just as he had thought: while the sheriff was away, the deputy would most certainly play. Or, in this instance, sleep. He stepped inside fully and closed the door behind him with a near-silent click. Carefully he crept closer and closer to the deputy's desk, and then stood up straight, folded his arms, and cleared his throat loudly and deliberately. Mike was sleeping quite soundly, feet up on the desk, head back, mouth open. It took 3 loud throat clearings to get him to startle awake. But it was gratifying when he did at last. He blinked woozily at Jordan, wiped his chin with the back of his hand, and then sat up straight, thumping his feet on the ground. Land's sakes, Jordan. You ought to know better than to creep up on a fellow like that, especially one totin' a gun. Jordan rocked back on his heels, grinning. Oh, you'd shoot your sheriff unprovoked? I wouldn't say it's unprovoked, exactly, Mike grumbled. What are you doing in this afternoon, anyhow? I thought you were spendin' time with your kid. Jordan took a seat across from his deputy, crossing one knee over the other. I thought I'd come in, scout out a little, see how things are going, he said easily. Can't be too bad, I guess, if the law is sleeping on the job. Mike leaned his elbows on his desk and rubbed at his face. Come on, Jordan, he said. You know it's been quiet in Shadow Gulch for ages now. 6 months, give or take a few weeks, I guess, Jordan allowed. I dunno that I'd say ages. Anyhow, you know how things can go around here. They could change at any moment. The 2 lawmen paused for a moment, listening reflectively. But apart from the usual hustle and bustle of the town, they heard nothing out of place. Mike grinned. Yeah, he said. Shadow Gulch is a regular city of sin these days. Thank the Lord that you're here to save us all, Jordan Tate. Jordan grinned back. Michael Chesley had worked with him since he'd come on the job as sheriff and had served as deputy to the fellow before him, too. He was experienced, if unpolished, and Jordan was grateful for the older man's knowledge. It was worth a little work time napping during the day to keep him on his side. Jordan himself had only been serving as sheriff in Shadow Gulch, Idaho, for about 3.5 years. Some days it felt as though he'd just taken up the Tin Star, others, it seemed as though he'd never done anything else. In his previous life, he'd been a rancher. Everything had changed on the day that his pretty, young wife Sarah had been killed in an outlaw raid. His focus, his drive, his dreams of the future all had crashed into a million tiny pieces, leaving him only with a small daughter and a burning desire to right the myriad wrongs of a world gone sour. Generally speaking, however, Shadow Gulch was a relatively quiet town. He'd had little chance to right many wrongs apart from settling disputes over cattle grazing land and breaking up the occasional weekend fistfight in the Broken Nail Saloon. But he held on, feeling as though every new thing that happened was training him for what was to come. Someday, he believed with all his heart, he would find the gang that had taken Sarah from him, and he would make it right. Justice would be done. In the meantime, Mike Chesley was leaning back in his chair purposefully, deliberately, as though he wasn't about to allow the arrival of the sheriff to interfere with his beauty sleep. Come on, Mike. Wake up, would you? You got something for me to do? Because if not, I don't see how my catching 40 winks will knock the world off its tracks. Justice never sleeps. Maybe so, but I bet it catches a nap or two on a Saturday afternoon. Besides. But Jordan never did find out what Mike was about to say next. The friendly banter between them was suddenly rent in two by the sound of gunshots in the square outside. Jordan was alert at once, and Mike fumbled his way to his feet, eyes wide. For all his lackadaisical appearance, he could move quickly when he wanted to. Sheriff and deputy moved as one toward the door, which Jordan flung wide. For a moment, standing in the bright sunlight, he couldn't quite put his finger on what was going on. But then he saw the movement of the crowd and heard a scream, and the sound of horses' hooves. "It's a raid," he said, voice low, and moved out. Behind him, he was vaguely aware that Mike was following him, crouched low, hand at the ready on the gun on his waist. But Jordan was sharply focused on the townsfolk of Shadow Gulch, all running away from the center of the noise. He ran toward it. If there was trouble, that was where he belonged. He could see almost at once that he was too late to do anything. His banter with Mike had held him up, had diminished his usual razor-sharp alertness to the sound of his town. And now, if he couldn't help those who needed him, he would be paying the price. And, he thought with anguish, so might someone else. They had hit the bank, of course. That came as no surprise. Shadow Gulch wasn't a big town, and apart from the general store and the trains that came through weekly, there wasn't much to steal from, but the bank was the largest one in the county, and when payroll for the larger ranches came through, it was well stocked enough to be a worthwhile target. But the excitement was clearly already over, and the outlaws were riding their horses on the way out. The gunshots must have been the warning shots, rather than any immediate threat to life and limb. With relief, his darting eyes registered no figures lying prone on the ground, no sobbing townsfolk bemoaning a tragedy. There were only a few wide-eyed clerks with frightened faces, rushing to the doorway of the bank as the robbers rode away. Yes, he was far too late. Even had he had the presence of mind to run to the stable and saddle his horse as soon as he heard the shots, he would still have missed the action. As it was, he caught only a glimpse of the gang as they rode hard for the edge of town, 4 of them, all masked, with hats pulled low over their eyes. Dusty, dirty clothes of brown and black, irrespective of the color they may have been when new and clean. 2 piebald horses, a chestnut, and a black mare with what looked like a vicious turn of speed. He had started to run after them without even fully realizing it, but now he faltered to a stop, shaking his head. Mike came up behind him, breathing heavily. "No point in chasing after them now," Jordan said. "There's only 2 of us, anyhow. We'd better assess the damage and make a plan." "Did you get a good look at them?" Mike wheezed. Jordan shook his head regretfully. "No, but their mounts, I did." He rattled off the specifics of what he had seen. "I reckon that won't be much help, but it's better than nothing. We'll just have to keep an eye out, that's all." He turned to Mike, folding his arms. "Meanwhile, what were you saying about Shadow Gulch being quiet for ages?" Mike opened his mouth to speak, then thought better of it and closed it again. His deputy was a wise man, Jordan reflected. He knew by now that a brush with any gang that came through would entirely remove any sense of humor from Jordan Tate, even a gang that was unlikely to be related to the group that had taken Sarah from him. 6 months, it had been 6 months since there had been much more in Shadow Gulch than the occasional scrap at the saloon. Jordan wished he could shake the feeling that all that was about to change. Chapter 2. The summer heat in Boston, Massachusetts, was near to stifling. Carrie Smith pushed open the window as high as she dared and got to her knees before the sill, almost as though she was praying, and if her stepfather came in and demanded what she was doing, that was precisely the excuse she would give. As it was, she felt as though she would suffocate if she didn't get a breath of fresh air. But the 3-story buildings on this side of town, as run down and dilapidated as they were, did not allow for many breezes in the summer months. She longed to be able to go outside, to find trees somewhere, running water. To sit in the quiet and simply not think. But that was impossible. She took a few deep breaths of the outside air, to steel her nerves as surely as a shot of whiskey, and then stood again, closing the window regretfully. Almost immediately, the stale air of the sickroom rushed back in over her, suffusing her senses. She fought with her desire to simply run away and leave it all behind, and simultaneously with the feeling of guilt for wanting to do so. She wouldn't, of course she wouldn't. She couldn't leave her mother behind. It had been 2 long, slow, painful weeks now that her mother had slowly been wasting away. It made Carrie want to cry to think of it, let alone to look at the slight figure under the sheet. She clenched her jaw and approached her mother, knowing that she was the only source of comfort that Adelaide Martin had left. Her husband did nothing for her, he had ceased to be a comfort long ago. If indeed he ever was one. Jeremy Martin had married Adelaide Smith nearly 4 years ago now, when Carrie was a fresh-faced 16-year-old. Her mother was just as pretty and youthful looking. Back then, she could easily pass as Carrie's older sister, which was no surprise. She'd had Carrie from her first marriage to her childhood sweetheart and was only 17 herself when Carrie had come into the world. The change in her now, such a short time later, was shocking. What was once youthful and girlish had turned into the sunken features of an old woman. At less than 40, she appeared 70. And while her weakness of health and propensity toward chest colds had certainly contributed to her sad state, Carrie knew for a certainty, in her heart, that it was Jeremy Martin's fault that her mother was so close to dying. From today, looking back on the past, it seemed impossible that Adelaide had been so naive. Martin told her only that he was a businessman and, new to Boston, she had believed it. And perhaps it wasn't really a lie, he did run a business, to be sure. But the type of business. If her mother had realized that her soon-to-be husband ran a house of ill repute in the poorer part of the city, of course she would never have married him. Carrie couldn't think of what they would have done. They were destitute after the death of her father, and the job that Adelaide had found in Boston had ended abruptly after only a few weeks, leaving them with rent looming above their heads. Then Jeremy Martin had swooped in, seeming to pick them out of the jaws of a sad fate, but in actual fact, consigning them to a future even more terrible. The only thing that could possibly redeem him at all, in the eyes of his stepdaughter, was the fact that he had never tried to force Adelaide into anything unseemly. No, Adelaide was the face of respectability that he craved. A beautiful, soft-spoken wife gave his business a veneer of gentility. But now he was scant inches from losing that, and Carrie shuddered to herself to think of what might be next in his grand plans. She sat in her usual chair next to her mother. Adelaide opened her eyes and managed to smile at her daughter. "Have you been sleeping?" Carrie asked gently, taking her mother's hand. "Yes, dear, a little. But you look very tired yourself." Carrie shook her head. She couldn't bring herself to speak the lie out loud. "It's a beautiful day outside," she said, keeping her voice low. Martin would hear if she spoke too loudly, and he didn't like there to be much noise from the top floor of the house. He said it interfered with business when his patrons were reminded that there was a family in the house. "Perhaps when you're a little stronger, I can help you outside for a while." Her mother's smile was faint and fading. "That sounds lovely, dear, but I don't think I'll ever get any stronger than I am now." Hot tears pricked at the back of Carrie's eyes. "Don't say that, Mama. No, the time is past for me to allow you any more kind lies, my darling. I'm dying, will be gone soon." She stopped and swallowed, though it was clearly painful for her. "Carrie, dear, go to my desk, the drawer, letters." Speaking was becoming more and more difficult. Swallowing hard herself, Carrie did as she was bid. The letters were in a familiar hand, the writing of Zelma Tate, Adelaide's childhood friend from out west. Carrie had never met her, but she couldn't remember a week ever going by in which her mother did not read out passages from Zelma's correspondence, often with a fond smile of reminiscence. The two had become friends when Adelaide was 7 and Zelma 12. The slight age gap between them had turned Zelma into a sisterly figure, looking out for her younger friend who had no siblings of her own. Zelma had left their small town to get married and move out west when she was 18. A handful of years later, Adelaide had done the same, heading east with her new husband. Carrie glanced over the letters as she sat back down at her mother's side. "Read them out," her mother requested faintly. Carrie unfolded the letter on top and began to read it, voice soft. "My dear sister friend. I so wish I could be there with you. My heart is right by your side. As you deal with this horrible illness, I hope that our agreement brings you some level of happiness and contentment. I can only imagine your feelings at the prospect of leaving your poor daughter alone, and again I reassure you that she will not be left on her own. You spoke of sending her soon. I only ask that you wait as long as possible, so that she might be with you. I would never take a daughter from her mother. Even though I do not have a daughter of my own, I can all too easily imagine what it must be like. My son Jordan is my light and my life, and I would want him with me as long as I draw breath. Please, don't fear that I won't honor our agreement. As soon as Carrie has need, she has a home with us. And I know Jordan will be willing to do anything he can to care for her. He is a gentle soul at heart, though he must be strong and manly to do his job as sheriff and doesn't let his softer side show very often. His tragedy with poor Sarah has changed him, and I hope one day to see again the man my son used to be. Just as your dearest wish is for Carrie to be cared for by someone who can love and protect her, my dearest wish is for Jordan to once more look at life with a warm light in his eyes. He has been driven by a desire for justice that renders him truly single-minded. But I hope that Carrie's presence, and the execution of our plan, will be the change that I so long for. It is strange to think, my dear friend, that after we have been so long apart, our children might come together in marriage. Carrie put the letter down in her lap and stared at her mother with wide eyes. Marriage, she whispered, only remembering just in time to modulate her voice. Swallowing hard past a dry throat, her mother nodded, closing her eyes. We've spoken about it, in the past, she said. Carrie had to bend close to hear. Almost as soon as I married your stepfather. But Mama, I can't marry someone I don't know. It will be a protection for you, my dear. Mama, Carrie whispered, and wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. The tears were coming on, no matter how hard she tried to fend them off. I won't leave you. Her mother opened her eyes and smiled, with an obvious effort. She reached out again for Carrie's hand and gave a squeeze. Her strength was so meager that it felt no stronger than the grip of a child. No, Adelaide whispered. Not before time. But when I am gone, Carrie. Mama, don't talk like that. When I am gone, promise me. Carrie hesitated, and her mother tightened her grasp again, briefly, giving it all she could. Promise me, she whispered again, more urgently. Carrie sighed deeply and met her mother's eyes. I promise, she said. In the brief silence that followed, she wondered what, exactly, she had given her word to. To marry a stranger? To involve herself in the lives of a family that she had never met, on the agreement of a woman whom her mother hadn't seen since she was very young? To travel to, wherever they lived, in order to get away from her stepfather? Whatever it was, she told herself, it didn't matter. Looking at the expression of peace on her mother's face, she knew that she would have agreed to all of that and more, just to bring that smoothness to her brow, relax the tightness around her mouth. She must do everything she could to make her mother's final days happy ones, no matter what came next. Chapter 3. Being a small-town sheriff in Idaho wasn't all chasing crooks and fending off gang attacks, of course. Some of it was politics, too, and that was Jordan's least favorite part. But the mayor of Shadow Gulch, Mr. Roswell Morrison, had made it very clear from his first days of office that he expected Jordan to report to him fully on any events of interest. Events of interest was an extremely politics-heavy way to describe gang raids, in Jordan's opinion, but the older man wouldn't budge on his terminology. He came from back east, he explained on the day after he was elected, and he wasn't about to succumb to the make-do, unprofessional methods of the Wild West just because he was such a recent transplant to the territories. And so, when Jordan went to meet with Mayor Morrison the week after the raid on the bank, he knew he was about to get an earful. As expected, Mayor Morrison reproached him thoroughly for not filling him in more readily on the events of the raid. Jordan put his hands behind his back and stood up straight, on the opposite side of the mayor's desk. He was rather more accustomed to the situation being reversed, with crooks and suspects standing ill at ease while he scrutinized them with narrowed eyes, but at least he knew how to handle it when the shoe was on the other foot. The truth is, Mayor Morrison, he said, I've been out with Mike looking for any trace of this gang. We spent 2 days to the west, because some of the folks in town thought they'd seen suspicious characters out past Two Hill Ranch. You went that far? That's 8 miles. We did, Jordan said, nodding gravely. That's out of your jurisdiction, Morrison said, eyebrows drawing down thunderously over his nose. Out of your jurisdiction, Jordan corrected him quietly. That part of the county doesn't have a sheriff to watch over it. Me and Elbert Markell over in Pew's Hollow take it in turns to do what we can for the folks in the wild country. I reckon chasing down a gang that might be habitat'n their falls is within my jurisdiction, right enough. Said Morrison. But you didn't find them. No. We didn't find them. There was a moment of quiet while Morrison folded his arms and eyed Jordan askance, likely thinking over what he wanted to say next. Well, here's a little bit of information for you, he said at last, abruptly. I got a wire from the sheriff's men over Eastway, Gerald Salt's men, out of Baker Hill. They say that a gang matching the description of the ones you saw rode through Baker Hill yesterday. They were headed toward Wyoming, by the look of it. Yesterday? Jordan frowned, calculating swiftly. That's nearly 300 miles, isn't it? They can't have been running their horses constantly. Morrison shrugged. Maybe they were and maybe they weren't. Either way, I trust their word, and can't imagine why you do not, given the source of the information. I don't think we'll be seeing that gang around here anymore. You trust their word? Jordan repeated. The word of men you've never met, over the word of your sheriff? Morrison folded his arms. With all due respect, Mr. Tate, you're not my sheriff. You were in place when I got here. Can't do much of anything about it now except try to work with you as best as I can. Hot anger leapt in Jordan's chest at the tone of the man's voice, but he tamped it down. I reckon that's the most any of us can do, Mr. Morrison, he said slowly. If that's all, I'll head on home. Haven't seen my daughter in nearly 3 days. He thought, for a brief second, that he caught a softening of the mayor's expression, but it might have been a figment of his imagination. Whatever the case, Mayor Morrison only nodded, acknowledging that Jordan had his permission to leave. Chafing, Jordan headed back out onto the hot, sunny street outside. He didn't know what irked him more, the man's manner or his obvious distrust of Jordan himself. Mayor Morrison was new in the area, and had little idea, if any, about the way things worked. How could he be so dismissive of Jordan, who had lived there his entire life? He heaved a sigh as he went on his way. Regardless of what the mayor said, or claimed to believe, Jordan couldn't rest so easy with the idea of the gang being out of their area. In his experience, when gangs were successful in their raids, they tended to try and strike again. There was nothing like a gang for pushing its luck. He'd seen it happen too many times. He was darned if he would let it happen on his watch, no matter what the mayor of Shadow Gulch said. Chapter 4. Jordan Tate's second favorite sound in the morning was the noise of eggs being cracked into the cast-iron frying pan. Eggs meant bacon or ham, they meant breakfast, they meant food, and as his mother always said, even though he was 26, he still ate like he was 16. His most favorite sound in the morning, his most favorite of all, really, was to hear his little daughter Aimee singing to her dolls in the sitting room. He came back in from feeding the chickens, caught the noise of Aimee's childish humming, and grinned to himself. No matter how down in the dumps he felt, no matter how frustrated his continual push for justice, no matter how bad his nightmares had been the night before, Aimee never failed to lift him up. She was as good as religion. It wasn't that he didn't believe in God, he did. But the aftermath of Sarah's tragic death, the constant pressure of fighting for justice, had left him with more questions than answers, questions he did not truly believe he would ever find an answer to, and questions that were uncomfortable to think about it. It was easier just to put it at the back of his mind and try to focus on what was right in front of him. Like Aimee. His daughter was 6 years old now, 6 years old. It seemed impossible. She'd been only just over a year when her mother had been taken from her, and Jordan knew that she had no memory of Sarah. Still, he had tried to tell her stories of what Sarah was like, and his mother did the same. Sometimes, Aimee would tell them that Sarah was sitting down to tea with her and her dolls, and it made Jordan smile to know that the little girl's mother had become something of an imaginary friend, there to spend time with her when she was at play. He got down on his knees beside Aimee, who smiled up at him sunnily. Sometimes she looked so much like her mother it made his chest hurt. "Good morning, girlie." "Good morning, Papa. What are you singing to the dolls today?" Obediently, Aimee began to sing again, only mistaking a word here and there. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray." He watched and listened, smiling. Suddenly, he realized that he was hearing another voice, singing along, though quietly. It was coming from the kitchen. He put a hand on her head as he stood and wandered in the direction of breakfast. Sure enough, his mother was hard at work fixing breakfast, and her voice was raised in song. She had her back to him and did not realize he had come in until he cleared his throat. Then she spun around, raising the steel spatula she was holding as though to combat anyone who came at her. Jordan laughed aloud, and she chuckled, relaxing her shoulders. "You ought to know better than to creep up on someone like that, son. Don't they teach you that in Sheriff ING school?" "Nope, never learned that. I've been catching all the bad guys through waiting for them to feel comfortable enough to sing. Works every time." He took a seat at the kitchen table, smiling up at her. Aimee came trotting down the hall and took a place next to him, her doll in her lap. "What's gotten into you? I haven't heard you sing in a very long time." "Oh, nothing," Zelma Tate said, sliding full plates across to her son and granddaughter, and seating herself across from them with her own plate in front of her. She picked up her fork, still humming. "Come on, Ma," Jordan said. "I know you well enough to realize you're plotting something. Last time I caught you singing, you were planning to throw me a surprise birthday party. Something's up, what is it?" Zelma looked at her granddaughter, who was trying to feed alternate bites to her doll. "Well, as a matter of fact," she said slowly, "I've had some news recently." "News? What kind of news?" "Oh, some good, some bad, that's the way it is in life, isn't it?" Said Jordan, noncommittally. The last thing he wanted to do was get his mother off track when she was actually telling him what was going on. "You remember my friend Adelaide, don't you? Your pen pal?" "Pen pal when we grew up, but we were close friends when we were younger. Lived in the same town until I met your father and moved here to Shadow Gulch." Poor Adelaide had a series of tragedies in her life. Her first husband passed away, leaving her with a young daughter. She remarried, and the second husband proved to be not a gentleman, for starters. Said Jordan, thinking over the rash of things that "not a gentleman" could entail. His mother darted a swift glance at Aimee. "Little pitchers have big ears," she murmured. Jordan nodded. "Carry on, Ma. We'll talk later. Adelaide has been ill for some time, and she was worried about what would happen to her girl, who must be close to 20 now. Well, when she wrote me about her worry, naturally I reassured her that we would care for her if anything happened." "We?" Jordan questioned. His mother nodded firmly. "Oh, Jordan, if you knew what I know about this girl's stepfather, you wouldn't hesitate to offer your protection. And that is just what I told Adelaide. No son of mine would turn down the outstretched hand of a young woman in need." "I see," said Jordan slowly. He was beginning not to like where this was going. "And just what does this help that we're giving entail?" Zelma Tate glanced over at her granddaughter once again, and Aimee met her gaze with a bright smile. "Dear, would you mind stepping back into the sitting room once more, just for a few minutes? Your father and I need to speak about something." "Can't I stay here?" "I won't listen." Her eager words belied her promise, and Jordan chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Better do what Grandma says, or she'll chase you out with a wooden spoon just like she used to do to me when I was your age." "Oh, all right," said Aimee, clearly discontent, but she obeyed, slipping back out of the room. Zelma put her hands on the table and leaned forward, looking directly at her son. "It is my dearest wish, and Adelaide's, too, that you will marry Carrie Smith," she said. "Adelaide and I have made an arrangement." Jordan's heart sank. "Ma, you can't do things like that." "But Jordan." "No, Ma. I'm a grown man with responsibilities, and a daughter to care for." "That's precisely it," Zelma argued, her natural stubborn streak already starting to show in the set of her chin. "You have a daughter to care for. I won't be around forever, Jordan. Just who will watch over Aimee when I'm unable to?" "I will." "Oh, really? Will you give up being the sheriff of Shadow Gulch? Will you give up chasing the bad men across hill and dale until you bring every last one of them to justice? Because if you can't promise to be there when your daughter needs you, then you have the obligation, as her father, to provide her with someone who will give her what she needs, when she needs it. She thinks the world of you now, Jordan, when she is 6 years old, but a few years from now, she will need a mother more than ever. Can you give her that?" Jordan put his head down low, staring at the smooth grain of the kitchen table. "You might be right, at that," he admitted slowly. "But you still had no right to do this." "You weren't handling it," said his mother softly. "All that occupies your mind is the justice that drives you, and that makes you a good sheriff, but it doesn't make you a good father. Not without help. I did what I thought was right, same as you always do, and I won't back down. I'll stand by it." Jordan shook his head and sighed. "Anyhow," he said, "this is hardly the time to be thinking about that. The peace in Shadow Gulch is over, I know it in my bones. That gang raid is just the first battle of many. Until I can catch them and throw them behind bars, I can't think about anything else." Zelma Tate reached out and put a hand on her son's arm, soothing him. Her face reflected her intimate knowledge of her son's pain, her empathy for him, and her unwillingness to let him carry on alone. "Carrie will be here in a week or so," she said. "I'll not turn the poor girl away." He couldn't help but feel some curiosity about what, precisely, sad fate this Carrie Smith was escaping, but he wouldn't give his mother the satisfaction of showing interest in her either. "I wouldn't ask you to do that," he said. "She's the daughter of your friend. We owe her hospitality for that, if nothing else." His mother nodded. "And later," she said. Jordan said nothing. "Later, we will speak about what should be done." With that, the both of them had to be content. Chapter 5. From the moment she began to pack her bags, to the moment that the train puffed to a stop in Shadow Gulch, Idaho, Carrie Smith was praying. She prayed first that her mother would rest in peace and be remembered favorably. She did not know what else to say about that, and she prayed the same thing over and over until her heart was comforted and soothed by the phrases. Then she prayed that her stepfather would not come suddenly into her room while she was packing. She prayed he wouldn't find her bag where she had stashed it out of doors, hidden around the back corner of the house, waiting to be retrieved. And, a day or two later, she prayed that he wouldn't think anything of it when she requested she be allowed out to go and visit her mother's grave. Her tears were verisimilitude enough, at any rate. Jeremy Martin had hesitated for a long, anguishing moment before he nodded without grace. "But when you come back," he said, his voice laden heavily with meaning, "we have something to talk about." She knew what he wanted to talk about. She knew, too, that she hadn't escaped a moment too soon. She prayed about that, too, as she hurried toward the Boston train station, with the strap of her bag looped over her shoulder, a bag that contained all her worldly goods. A few changes of clothing, her mother's Bible, the letters from Zelma Tate, what little money she had been able to scrape together, and a tintype photo of her mother when young, long before Jeremy Martin had appeared to haunt her nightmares. All through the train trip, through every stop, through every halt, through every delay, she prayed. And now, over a week later, she was finally here. This was the last step, the last hurdle, finally putting a face to the name of Zelma Tate. Not to mention, finally putting a view to the name of Shadow Gulch, Idaho. The town was much smaller than Boston, of course, but she had expected that. The buildings were all of clapboard, standing sturdily in the melting heat of the summer afternoon. There were sparse pine trees here and there, and she could see forests in the distance, at the end of each street. The walls were unpainted, and the signs that hung from each establishment were made of planks with burned wood lettering, simple and straightforward. There were rough, uneven plank sidewalks, dozens of passers-by in the street, horses and small farm carts and buggies and, even for someone who was raised in Boston, this much difference, this much hustle and bustle, was overwhelming. She stood at the edge of the platform, holding tightly to her bag with both hands, and tried to catch her breath. The only thing that really helped was reminding herself that this, above all, was what she had been praying for, a safe arrival in her new hometown. And to be met with kindness. Almost on the very thought, her eyes lit on a woman in middle age, standing just down in the walkway that led along the edge of the platform, craning her neck and clearly searching for someone. Carrie's heart lifted. If only this kindly-looking woman was Zelma Tate, come to bring her home. Swallowing nervously, she approached her. "Excuse me, are you Mrs. Tate?" "Zelma Tate?" The woman turned to look at her, and there was a flood of warmth and emotion in her eyes in an instant. "Why, you can't be anyone other than Carrie Smith. My dear, you look exactly like your mother, the spitting image." She rushed forward and put a hand on either of Carrie's arms, gazing at her raptly. "I could almost believe that it was your mother herself, except I know that she's gone to her reward. My poor dear, I'm so sorry for what you've been through. Your mother was the sweetest soul that ever lived, and the world is sadder for her passing." Before she knew it, Carrie was being engulfed in two strong arms, drawn into the circle of Zelma Tate's embrace. She held stiffly against it for a second and then relaxed into the feeling of being welcomed. This was exactly the warmth and safety of welcome she had prayed for, and she knew she should be nothing but grateful, as hot as it was rapidly becoming, standing in the sun with Zelma Tate wrapped about her. At last, she drew back. "Let me look at you. Yes, yes, so much like your mother. And she was such a pretty young girl when I left. I know she blossomed into a beauty. You must take after her to every detail. My dear," and here she reached out and took hold of Carrie's bag, lifting it away from her effortlessly. With her free hand she took hold of Carrie's arm and began to walk. "I don't know how much your mother told you about our friendship, but we've known each other practically since we were in short petticoats." Carrie couldn't help but smile. "Yes, I know," she said. "Mama always told me that you were her oldest friend. I am, at that, and a good handful of years older than your sainted mama, too." Zelma cast a wink back at Carrie. "But I'll thank you not to mention that to others. Look, my dear, here is our buggy. I don't take it out usually, because the horse has arthritis in his knees, but I thought you might need help with your baggage. And then you show up with only this little bitty thing. Why, you must have fled in the night." "Not exactly," said Carrie, tentatively, "but, well, it's true that I left most of my things at home." "Did Mama?" She paused, fighting the urge to weep that the thought of her mother seemed to bring on her each and every time. She gulped, getting past the feeling enough to continue. "Did Mama tell you anything about my stepfather?" "Something, yes," said Zelma, her face darkening. She tossed Carrie's bag up into the back of the buggy and showed Carrie how to climb her way up into the driver's box before settling down at her side. "Plenty, I'll be bound, to know what sort of fellow he is. I'm glad that you're well away from it all." "Me, too," Carrie whispered, feeling suddenly quite overwhelmed with exactly how glad she was. No longer in Boston, no longer in the city of her birth, no longer at the house she had reluctantly called home for the past 4 years, now she was starting anew, with a strong and vibrant woman at her side, ready and willing to look out for her. She hadn't felt this optimistic in years. "Well, now, I don't know precisely what your ma said to you about my son, Jordan," Zelma went on, her voice suddenly turning a bit hesitant. "But your mother and me, we had, call it an agreement, I suppose." She was looking at Carrie, waiting for a response. Carrie smiled. "I know," she said. "Mama told me all about it and explained it to me. How it was for my own protection." Zelma nodded eagerly. "For your protection, and my son's happiness," she said. "A benefit and a blessing to both." "Yes, but I have to admit, Mrs. Tate, it's a difficult situation to be put in. After all, your son and I don't know each other." "Oh, pish-posh," said Zelma, waving a hand. "I hardly met my husband before we were married. He was an acquaintance of my father's, they worked together. But he was a good man, and my father trusted him. And I trusted my father. It all worked out just fine. Knowing a man to speak to on the street isn't the same thing as knowing him, anyhow. Sometimes you have to trust the one who does know. And you know your son, I'm sure." I do, said Zelma simply. He's no saint, any more than any other man, but a man better and braver you would be hard-pressed to find. He's just like his daddy, handsome, full to the brim with courage, and stubborn as a stain. Carrie laughed. And how does he feel about the agreement that you had with my mother? Zelma turned to look at her, her face sobering. She hesitated, as though she had something to say, but the cart was passing by a whitewashed, freestanding building, and she turned away abruptly and pulled the horse to a stop. Hold up, Napoleon. This here's the Shadow Gulch School, she informed Carrie, smiling. And it's just about time for the children to be let out for the day. Perfect timing to meet Aimee. Aimee? Zelma cast a direct glance at her, as though weighing what to say and how to say it. My granddaughter, Aimee, she said, gently. Jordan's little girl. I don't suppose your mother said anything about poor Sarah. Carrie's heart fluttered. I read a few of your letters, she said. I know that Sarah was your daughter-in-law, and she was killed. Zelma nodded. In a raid, she said. It was clear that she didn't wish to discuss it any further. It must still have been very painful for her. Our lives have never been the same since, of course, and Aimee never knew her mother. Jordan and I have been doing our best to bring her up in a way that would make Sarah proud. Her lips tightened. That's all, she said softly, and then there was the sound of a baker's dozen of children being released into the world on a summer afternoon. A little girl with a cloud of soft brown curls and wide blue eyes zoomed over to them, calling out, Grandma. Grandma. Zelma hopped down from the cart and bent to scoop the girl up. Hello, my darling, how many boys did you kick in the knees today? 2, said Aimee, with satisfaction. Zelma laughed and put her into the box, where she sat next to Carrie with a frankly curious gaze. Aimee, this is Miss Carrie Smith. She's going to come and live with us. For good? Aimee said. Carrie smiled at her. I hope so, she said. Do you not like your home anymore? Aimee pressed, trying to understand a concept that was clearly foreign to her. Carrie hesitated, unsure of what to say, and met Zelma's gaze. Aimee's grandmother put an arm around the little girl. No, it isn't that at all, she said calmly. Her mother passed away, and she doesn't have a papa or a grandma to care for her. So she's coming to live with us, so that she won't be alone. Your mother? Aimee said, putting a hand on Carrie's wrist and looking up at her with wide eyes. So, you're like me? The simple words, spoken without an abundance of emotion but simply as a straightforward truth, caught at Carrie's heart. She wanted to sweep the girl up in her arms and cry for both of them, for the mothers they had both lost. She swallowed hard and nodded, controlling herself. Yes, dear, she whispered. We're the same. Aimee thought about this for a moment. Then, to Carrie's amazement, she leaned over and flung her arms around her waist. Zelma, dashing a tear from her eyes, smiled mistily at Carrie and then lifted the reins. Come on, Napoleon, she said. Let's go home. Chapter 6. The house belonging to the sheriff of Shadow Gulch, Idaho, was a modest little place with 2 stories and 3 bedrooms. It wasn't far from the station, and even closer to the schoolhouse. When they arrived, it was nearing 4 o'clock in the afternoon and Aimee was starving. Zelma gave her a bread roll and a piece of cheese and sent her upstairs to move her toys from her bedroom into her grandmother's. She'll share with me, for as long as need be, she explained to Carrie, leading the way into the kitchen, and putting on the kettle for tea. There's plenty of room for us all, no reason why you shouldn't have some space to yourself. Thank you, Carrie said gratefully. I hate to put you out. Oh, it's no trouble, Zelma assured her. She sleeps beside me half the time anyhow. She doesn't like to sleep alone if she can avoid it. She's always after Jordan and me to get her a cat so she doesn't have to climb into bed with one or the other of us. She kicks, too, she added, with a rueful smile. Sometimes I think she does it on purpose just to convince us about the cat. Carrie laughed. She's a smart girl, and adorable, of course. She is that, her grandmother acknowledged frankly. I'm as proud as could be of Aimee, and that's a fact. Pride may be a sin, but it would be a bigger sin not to cherish that little girl within an inch of her life. And her father feels the same way, I imagine? Zelma put down 2 teacups, taking her time and thinking. Jordan adores her, she said. But he has the unfortunate handicap of being the sheriff here in town, and he's driven by his need to avenge what happened to poor Sarah. I'm not saying he's wrong to want to right what happened and bring them to justice, but I'm not blind to my boy's faults, even though he is my only son and I love him more than I love myself, as a mother should. He needs to change his focus. Needs to see life as it really is, not just what he's striving for. How does he feel about my being here? Carrie ventured, half afraid to hear the answer. Zelma bit her lip. He'll shelter and protect you, she said. No gentleman could do less than that. But what about the agreement between you and my mother? Does he know about it? Yes, of course. I told him myself. Carrie had the feeling that she was trying to pin down someone who simply did not want to be pinned. And, does he agree with it? A moment passed. My son, Zelma said thoughtfully, needs time, that's all, time to realize what's really important. She flashed Carrie a smile. I have a hunch you can help with that. This, of course, did not answer Carrie's question at all. If anything, it led to more questions. She was opening her mouth and preparing to ask them when she suddenly became aware of a change in the air of the kitchen. Zelma turned swiftly and looked to the doorway, and Carrie followed her gaze with her own. Standing on the threshold was the most handsome man she'd ever seen. He had a soft cloud of brown curls, much like his daughter. His eyes, though, were a wide, dark hazel green. He held his hat in his hand, respectfully, and he wore his well-cut clothing with an easy grace. His shoulders were broad, torso tapering to a narrow waist, around which was looped a holster with a silver-trimmed pistol. A shiny tin star was pinned on his chest. There was no doubt as to who he was. Carrie realized that her breath had stopped in her throat, her heart was beating wildly. She'd never had a reaction quite like this to any man that she'd ever seen, and she felt a hot blush finding its way up to her cheeks. Thankfully, Zelma spoke, and Carrie was grateful for the distraction. Jordan, she said, warmly. Come on in and sit down. This here is Carrie Smith, the daughter of my old friend Adelaide. Jordan Tate hesitated in the doorway. Carrie had the feeling that he was thinking far ahead, trying to see the future. What would happen if he came and sat down, as he was bid? And what would happen if he didn't? At last he said, somewhat gruffly, I'll go and say hello to my daughter first, of course. I hear you are fallen on hard times, Miss Smith. You are welcome to spend as much time in my house as is necessary. He met her eyes, though she sensed that it cost him some effort, and nodded before walking back down the hall. She let out a breath that she wasn't aware she had been holding, feeling as though she was sinking into a puddle in her chair. When she glanced over at Zelma, it was to see a brave smile. Well, then, said Zelma Tate with forced cheerfulness. Seems to me you two have hit it off already. Yes indeed, you're going to get along like a house afire. A house afire, an apt metaphor, Carrie thought desperately. Doomed to nothingness and ash, and already the fire was lit and burning brightly, merrily blazing down. From the moment she had seen Jordan Tate, she knew that her life would be spent pining after him. She'd never seen anyone so handsome, and she'd never been so physically drawn to a man. And her mother had arranged for her to marry him. It was just her luck, she thought miserably, that the best laid plans of mice and mothers went so often awry. Chapter 7. Carrie could only hope that things would become easier, the longer she was in town. After all, it wasn't as though Jordan Tate objected to her presence. No, he seemed ready to endure it, though certainly not in any frame of mind to consider matrimony, no matter how much his mother schemed on his behalf. And so, the thing to do seemed to be simply put the whole prospect of marriage right out of her mind, focusing instead on what she could do, what she could control, as little as that was. She could make herself helpful around the house, and this she did with a will and a way. Her mother had raised her to cook and clean, although in the last 4 years she'd had little chance to go anywhere in the home. They lived in apart from the top floor. Their meals had been delivered to them, a frightened-looking maid had cleaned their apartments. But Carrie knew how, nonetheless, and now that she had an opportunity, she seized it with both hands. It was good to keep herself busy, keep herself occupied. Zelma continued to be rather a delight. She was sharper of tongue than Carrie's mother had been, with a sense of humor that simply wouldn't quit. But she also had a kind side to her, a generosity of spirit and heart that compelled her to reach out to those around her who needed help of any sort. As Carrie drew closer to her, she saw how much she herself benefited from this instinct, and saw clearly why Adelaide had developed such lasting affection for Zelma Tate. Aimee, too, was an unexpected delight. From the moment she realized how much she and Carrie had in common, she had evidently made it her mission in life to ensure that Carrie was happy and content in her new surroundings. Whenever they were in the same room, she constantly looked to Carrie with a ready little smile, as though to make sure that she was lacking for nothing. When she went out to play with the other children her age, she invariably brought home a handful of wildflowers for Carrie's appreciation, or a pretty rock to seek Carrie's approval. She even forewent sitting next to her father one evening after supper for sitting next to Carrie and watching her patiently mend a stocking. Her adoration was plain for all to see, and it made Carrie's heart grow warm to think of it. It didn't seem to do much for Jordan Tate, however. No matter how much his daughter doted on their new visitor, he scarcely greeted her with anything less than a polite expression and a serious, "How do you do, Miss Smith?" There was no warmth in him, and it was almost shocking after the friendliness she felt from both his mother and his daughter. This, she felt, was what Zelma must mean when she spoke about how she wanted to see the man her son had once been once again. She could understand it and sympathize with it, but she hadn't the faintest idea what she was meant to do about it. A week went by while she pondered this conundrum, a week in which she saw Jordan Tate only in the evenings, when he came home in time for supper. He didn't engage much even with his mother, though she saw the fond looks he cast constantly at his daughter. He seemed, on the whole, to be preoccupied. She supposed that was what life was like for a sheriff, small town or no. As for the rest of her time, she spent it in happy companionship with Jordan's mother and daughter, going for walks, picking wildflowers, doing the chores, mending clothes, visiting friends, baking bread, and helping Aimee with her lessons from school. Aimee was a very smart girl, but she had a marked difficulty with sums. The first time she brought a slate to Carrie and asked for help with her arithmetic, Carrie hardly knew what to say. The fact that the little girl had come to her, and was looking at her with such trusting eyes, made her spirit rally to the cause. "Very well, dear," she said, putting her arm around Aimee. "Let's go sit outside on the veranda, and we'll work on everything together." There followed a solid half-hour that left both of them sick to the teeth of numbers, but laughing about it all the same. Aimee had a peculiar trick of writing some of her numbers backward, which accounted for at least half her difficulty in learning her facts, and as often as Carrie suggested she remember to write them the correct way round, Aimee seemed to forget and revert to her usual method. By the end of the half-hour, the two of them were giggling furiously at every mishap, but the sums had been completed to the satisfaction of both. Aimee set the slate down and turned back to Carrie with a wide smile. "Miss Carrie, may I ask a favor?" Her manner was so polite and grown-up that Carrie had to chuckle, tweaking a lock of her hair. "Yes, Miss Aimee, you certainly may." Aimee looked down in her lap. "Next week is the music recital, our Sunday school class. This is my second year that I've been old enough. I'm sure you'll be the star of the show. Would you come watch?" She looked up at her suddenly, eyes beseeching. Last year, all the other children had mothers that would come. And Papa was so busy he couldn't. Grandma came to watch, but none of the others just had grandmas. Carrie's heart went out to the little girl, so hopeful, but clearly so afraid that even this simple request would be turned down. She put an arm around her and hugged her tight. "I would be honored to be there and watch you take Shadow Gulch by storm," she said, and she meant every word. Even if nothing ever happened with Jordan Tate, she reflected, she couldn't be sorry that she'd made this decision. His daughter and Zelma were reward enough for leaving her old life behind. Chapter 8. The last thing on Jordan Tate's mind was the visitor who had come to stay with them. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. In actual fact, the longer Carrie Smith was around, the more she kept popping into his head at the most inopportune of times. He could count on one hand the number of times he'd actually had more of a conversation with her than a simple, "How do you do?" But it seemed disproportionately outweighed by the frequency with which she set foot in the corridors of his mind and blithely took over his thoughts. His fault, he told himself, was in seeing at once how pretty she was. If he had just been able to hold that realization at bay, he wouldn't be having the trouble with concentrating that he was having now. But she had come upon him as a surprise. Though his mother had told him that she was coming, he'd been so preoccupied with his hunt for the gang that he had more or less forgotten about it. Then suddenly he was about to step into the kitchen and caught sight of the prettiest girl he'd seen in a very, very long time. She didn't look a bit like Sarah. Where Sarah had been fair, this girl had dark brown hair, long and straight. Where Sarah had been tall and willowy, this girl was on the petite side, with a round, pleasant face and delicate features. Jordan wasn't sure if he felt guilty for being immediately attracted to her because she didn't resemble Sarah in the least, or simply because she was another woman, an unknown. But of course, she wasn't entirely unknown. His mother had told her she was coming, and he should have paid attention to when. Maybe then he would have been more prepared for her. Then again, maybe not. He rubbed at his face with both hands and heaved a sigh. He needed to focus, he had too much on his plate as it was, and couldn't afford to allow himself the distraction of the pretty woman in his house, no matter how often his mother reminded him that he was practically engaged to be married to her. The trouble was that he seemed to have hit a wall in his investigation on the gang that had come through town. Perhaps, as Mike kept telling him, he was expending too much time and energy on them. After all, no one had really been hurt, and the amount of money they had stolen could certainly have been higher. But Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of the gang. And he didn't want to wait for them to come back. He wanted to find them, fight them, bust them up, and throw them in jail, where all their kind deserved to be. At the meeting with the mayor that afternoon, he informed Morrison of this, though in somewhat more official language. Morrison listened, nodding now and then, but kept his eyes on the desk in front of him. When Jordan finally stopped with his report of how things had been going in the town, Morrison sat back and sighed. "Mr. Tate, I seem to recall that we discussed this gang, some time ago." "We did," Jordan acknowledged. "Just under a week after they came through. And did I not tell you that I'd been informed they were seen heading west toward Wyoming?" "You did. So why is it that you're spending so much time on hunting for them here in Shadow Gulch?" "Forgive me for saying so, but it seems rather counterintuitive, shall we say?" Jordan gritted his teeth. "We have no real guarantee that the gang seen heading west was the same gang that hit the town," he said, as patiently as possible. "If there's any chance at all, that those jokers are still hanging around, well, I need to be ready for them." Morrison said, softly, "And you won't simply let it go, because I've told you to?" "With all due respect, Mayor Morrison, you aren't my boss. The law is the only thing that has the right to tell me what to do, and I won't sleep on any possibility that could cause harm to my town." Morrison nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Jordan. "I need to know that I can count on you, Sheriff Tate." "You can always count on me to do the right thing, Mayor Morrison." It seemed almost like a standoff, the way that Morrison met his eyes and wouldn't back down. Jordan puzzled over that meeting for the rest of the day. He didn't much care for Morrison, but at least the man seemed to care about the town. That being said, he was far too quick to write off the gang on the word of someone he didn't know. In the end, he had acknowledged that Jordan would do what he felt was right to do, and Jordan was sure Morrison wouldn't stand in his way, at least, not too much. Something about the whole situation just seemed off, and he couldn't put his finger on what, precisely, it might be. He was still pondering over it as he arrived home that evening. Opening the door, he heard the sound of a low voice, a voice that was young and girlish and which he had often heard raised in song, his daughter. But there was something different about the cadence now, and he closed the door softly behind him, listening hard. She was reading, he realized abruptly. And what was more, she was reading from the Psalms. "I will both lay me down in peace, and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety." Her voice carried on, stumbling slightly over "makest," and he heard another voice coach her smoothly through the word. He stepped around the corner to look in at the sitting room, and the scene that met his eyes made his breath catch. His daughter sat next to Carrie Smith, cuddled up close and as comfortable as could be. The old family Bible, big enough to spread across both their laps, was opened between them. Carrie pointed out the words with her finger as Aimee followed along, reading out loud. When she reached the end of the verse, she blew out a big breath of exhaustion and triumph and turned to Carrie with a face full of delight and pride. Carrie pulled the little girl in for a hug, laughing. "You're doing so well. I reckon your papa will be delighted to hear how you've come along." "I reckon he will, too," Jordan said softly. His daughter's eyes flew to him, and she scrambled up from underneath the heavy Bible, screeching with happiness. "Papa's home." She flung her arms around his waist, and he bent down to hug her, grinning first at her and then turning it on Carrie. The young woman sat poised on the edge of the sofa, luminous eyes fixed on father and daughter, seeming as though she wanted to join them but hesitated to insert herself into the family unit. When she caught sight of his smile, an answering smile spread warmly over her face, setting her eyes alight and twisting sharply at his heart. Something started, then and there, something he had tried to ward off as long as she'd been there. But he couldn't think about it now. Aimee stepped back and looked up at him. "Papa, Carrie's going to come to my recital." "She can, can't she?" "Of course, she can," he said, smiling down at her. "I think we'll make it a family outing." Aimee practically did a cartwheel from her excitement. "Oh, Papa, you mean you'll come too?" He frowned thoughtfully, and then the memory rang a bell. Yes, he hadn't gone to the recital the previous year, had he? He couldn't remember why not. There must have been a reason, something to do with work, but the realization swept over him that, though he remembered no details about what had seemed all important at the time, he did remember very clearly that he wasn't there for his daughter when she wanted him to be. And evidently, she remembered that as well. That struck him to the heart. He hugged his little girl close again. "Of course, I will," he murmured once more. "Of course, I will." Again, his eyes caught those of Carrie Smith. She was smiling as though pleased, as though proud of him, and though it made little sense to him, it made him feel good all the same to have her approval, however unwarranted. Yes, something had begun that day, and it made him feel helpless, caught in the tide of it, and blissful at the same time. He wondered what would happen next. Chapter 9. After the third time Aimee twisted away from Carrie while she was attempting to plait her curls, Carrie said, "Goodness, I've never known a girl could be such a grasshopper. I've half a mind to give up." Zelma had been observing with amusement from the other side of the kitchen table. "She was like this last year, too," she said. "Just a little bundle of nerves." "I need to check the weather," Aimee said from the window, craning her neck so she could look into the clear blue sky. "Teacher said if there's rain that we will post it." Zelma and Carrie exchanged a smile. "Postpone, dear," Carrie said, taking her by the shoulders and drawing her back toward the table. "Now hop back up on the chair, and I'll finish with your braid. That's all that's lacking, and then we can be off to the town hall." "But I didn't see if Papa was coming." "He won't be coming home," Zelma put in, reaching out to smooth a hand over her granddaughter's hand. "He'll come direct from the sheriff's office and meet us there at the hall. He's very busy, you know." "I know," said Aimee, but she was pouting, that much was clear. Carrie tied the ribbon at the end of her plait and threw her arms around the girl, drawing her close. "You're going to be the star of the show," she whispered. "And your father's going to be so proud, just like your grandmother and me." Aimee turned to her and put her arms around her neck with the sudden affection that was common to her. "I love you, Carrie. I'm glad you're going to live with us forever and ever." Carrie blinked back the sudden tears that came to her eyes and hugged the little girl in turn. "I love you too, Miss Aimee," she said. "Now, let's get to the town hall so you can show us all what you can do." Aimee wasn't just a smart little girl. She wasn't just a cute little girl, either. She was, Carrie thought as she watched her on the makeshift stage of the town hall, a born performer. The children all sang together, but Aimee most definitely sang the loudest. As she watched and laughed and applauded, she became aware of the strangest feeling, the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced side to side. It wasn't an unpleasant sensation, accompanied by a prickling on her neck. It was something else, something undefined that made her want to blush. She turned slightly to her left and realized that, across the aisle, Jordan Tate had finally made it to the recital from his all-encompassing work. But he wasn't looking at his daughter, he was looking at her. There was a warmth and a light in his eyes that she must have sensed, and which must have caused the impulse to blush. He was looking at her with appreciation and respect, and something more. As soon as he realized that he'd been caught, of course, his head turned and he returned his gaze to the stage, where his daughter was taking her final bow. But the feeling of weight, of being looked at by him, remained, and Carrie realized suddenly that her heart was thumping wildly. He said nothing about the incident, of course, as they gathered around Aimee afterward for hugs and congratulations. He'd brought her a bouquet of wildflowers, which was quite possibly the most adorable thing that Carrie had ever seen, she thought privately. Then, to her surprise, he handed her a small bouquet, too. She took it from him, lifting it to her nose to breathe in deep the wild, sweet green smell of the cornflowers and Queen Anne's lace, then dared at last to look at him. His eyes were direct and kind. "Thank you," he said, "for all you've done for my daughter." Carrie blushed and felt a stammer coming on before she even opened her mouth. I haven't done anything, really." "Oh, no, you have," he assured her, nodding. "You have." Then his eyes were turned back to Aimee, and Carrie felt a bit weak in the knees in the aftermath. Somehow, though she wasn't entirely sure how, she found her way home alongside the Tate family. Zelma must have noticed something, for Carrie caught more than one curious glance in her direction. But nothing was said, and when they arrived home, they had a late supper with conversation largely dominated by Aimee, who insisted on minutely dissecting the performances of each and every one of her classmates, including a lengthy list of both pros and cons that had to be carefully curated by the grown-ups in order to focus on the positive. Afterwards, Zelma gathered Aimee up and carried her away to bed. Grateful for a small chance to be by herself, Carrie slipped outside and took refuge in a rocker on the veranda. The summer night had cooled a little to where she was grateful for the shawl she'd wrapped around her shoulders. Though they were right in town, there were few sounds of others around them, and what she could hear were the faint and far-off noises of happy families, leading their day-to-day lives, going about their evening routines. She smiled to herself, a bit sadly, and drew the shawl closer. It was such a beautiful area, though it still struck her as foreign, compared to Boston. Even here in the town, with houses on either side, she didn't get anywhere near the same feeling as when she was in the city. But she told herself, that was no bad thing. She certainly did not miss her old life. The door behind her opened and shut almost silently, and she turned to see Jordan Tate standing there. Their eyes caught and held for a moment, and she felt her heart start to thump slowly at first, gradually growing more and more wild. Then he looked away, giving her a brief, blessed moment of relief, and came to stand near her, with his back to the view, leaning against the banister. "You look sad," he said softly. "Do I?" She sighed, trying to regain her composure. "I don't mean to. I suppose I was just thinking about my mother, and how much she would have loved to have come here. To visit Zelma, and to meet you and Aimee. She thought of you all as though you were family, I think. Even though she never met you. I'm sorry she never made it here. Ma always talked about her in such glowing terms, as though she was the sweetest person alive. She was, at that. She always thought the best of everyone, wanted the best for everyone. I think that's how she ended up in such tragic circumstances, in the end. Ma told me about what happened. I'm sorry, Carrie." It was the first time that he had used her first name in such casual intimacy. For some unknown reason, it made her heart flutter and soar, like a bird. She didn't know where to look. If she looked at him, surely he would see the longing there in her eyes. Not just for him, but for simpler, sweeter, happier times. The longing for things to change. The longing for things to get better. "I miss her," she whispered. "She loved you a lot. That much I know." She did. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling tears trembling on her lashes, and then opened them again to focus on him. "That's why she sent me here, because she thought that I would be safe here. And she was right, Jordan assured her. I guess you know what else she and Ma had cooked up between them. Yes, that you and I should be married. He nodded, and she chuckled lightly, ruefully. I don't know what got into Mama to think that she could just make that decision for you, or for me, for that matter. Did you agree to it, when she told you? She took in a deep breath. I suppose I did, she said softly. He stepped closer to her and put out his hand. Hardly daring to breathe, she took his hand and allowed him to bring her to her feet. This close, he seemed impossibly taller than her, and when he bent low to speak directly to her, she felt a thrill that came from the bottom of her feet and ran all the way up to the crown of her head. I didn't, he said, but it isn't because I didn't want to. It's because, well, I have a responsibility. Yes, she whispered. I know you do, your work. My work. I owe it to Shadow Gulch to be the best sheriff I can be, they rely on me. But now I know that it's more than that. Somehow, along the way, I lost sight of my responsibility to Aimee, and to my mother, and to Sarah's memory. Family must come first. That's exactly how I've always felt, she said softly. Mama was everything to me, and she was all I had. He nodded. Well, he said, you've got more now. Yes, thank you. I'm so grateful for it. And we've got you. He trailed off, his eyes fixed on hers, and then suddenly, before she even knew what was happening, he was drawing her even closer to him. She went willingly into the warm circle of his arms and lifted her face to his as he kissed her gently. Around them, the happy, far-off noises of the sweetness of everyday life went on. Chapter 10. As the afternoon light crawled slowly over the wall of the sheriff's office, Jordan watched it unseeing. Every now and then, he took in a deep breath and let it out slowly again, in the vain hope that this small action would somehow help him to reach a decision. The trouble was, he was very good at diagnosing the trouble, he realized, but absolutely terrible at actually fixing it. The trouble was that he had let his guard down. He shouldn't have kissed Carrie Smith last night. He wasn't sorry that he did. No matter how he railed against himself for it, he couldn't regret it. He'd do it again, given the chance. And that was the real trouble. He liked kissing her and had the hankering to do it again as soon as was possible. But it was a distraction. She was a distraction. He needed to focus on his work, on finding the gang before they struck again. Before they did any real damage, as the gang had done 4 years ago when his poor lost Sarah had found herself in the middle of a disaster she could never have imagined. It was painful to think about, painful to let his memories wander back in that direction, but it happened anyhow. He thought of the day that the gang had ridden through. It had happened at the end of the day, when the 6 o'clock supper hour was drawing near, and everyone was thinking about going home to their families. He himself had heard the thundering of the horses as they moved through the town. Not realizing what it could possibly mean, he had stood still for a moment, and then motioned to Sarah to stay where she was in the aisle of the general store. He had run out to see what all the commotion was, and that was when he heard the screams and the yells. The gang was heading toward him at a tremendous rate. Hardly pausing to think, knowing only that there was something terribly wrong, he had drawn his pistol from where it always sat at his hip, and fired at the oncoming horsemen. His only goal had been to slow them down. He could see the sheriff riding along after them, hell-bent for leather but too far behind. He aimed for their midsections, rather than their heads, but his aim had gone wide, and the gang had not taken kindly to his efforts. Before he knew what was happening, they were firing back on him. He dodged, rolled, come up behind a banister and crouched and hid, and that was when he realized, with dawning horror, that Sarah had ignored his warnings and followed after him, straight into the crossfire. He closed his eyes and put his hands over his face, trying to wipe the memory from his mind. Even now, 5 years later, he could not shake the sensation that he was guilty of her death, somehow. There must have been something he could do, some way he could have made her stay there, safely inside. Or if he hadn't shot at them, perhaps they wouldn't have opened fire. He'd been told, by his mother and the local pastor and friends alike, that he carried no real guilt. That his feelings were the natural result of going through that horrible tragedy and being left to carry on with his little motherless girl. Maybe they were right. Maybe, deep down at the heart of it, it wasn't his fault, it was just a terrible thing that had happened to an innocent woman. But that didn't make him feel any better. He had an obligation, now, to do what he could to keep that from happening to anyone else. And that meant, no matter what Mike said, no matter what the mayor said, hunting down that gang before they could strike again. The door opened and Mike came in, almost as though Jordan's thoughts had called him. He was wide-eyed, his sallow face flushed with red. "What's wrong, Mike?" His deputy gulped and shook his head. He was short of breath and his words came hard. "Those men, the gang." Jordan got to his feet immediately. "Yes," he said alertly. "What about them, Mike?" "Think I saw them," Mike managed. "Over out behind the saloon, in the alley leading to Barry's field." Jordan frowned. What could they be doing back there? Mike shook his head again. Dunno, that's why I came to you. Thought you ought to go see." "You're right." Jordan tapped the tin star on his chest reflectively, ensuring that it was still on straight, then checked to see that his pistol was properly holstered. He took his hat from its peg on the wall and came around the desk. "Let's go, Mike." "I'm right behind you, Jordan." "I promise." The sheriff of Shadow Gulch rushed from the jailhouse and into the town square. Swiftly he stopped and scrutinized the area for any signs of disturbance of the peace, but there were none. No thunder of horses running from afar, no screams or cries or yells. It was a quiet, sunny afternoon and the only noises were the sounds of life going on as usual. He gritted his teeth. That just meant that the gang hadn't started yet. He ran toward the saloon, not even casting a glance over his shoulder to see that Mike was at his heels. The older man was a little out of shape, and he would undoubtedly need some time to recover before he was able to head out again. No matter, he would come when he could. It was obvious that time was of the essence. If the gang was there, what could they be planning? More importantly, how could he stop it? There was no time to call for backup. He had no one to call, anyhow. The only person who might possibly have been able to answer was Mayor Morrison, and Jordan certainly wasn't about to involve that man any more than he had to. Jordan raced along the sidewalk and to the entrance of the alleyway that led down the side of the saloon before doubling crossways and heading out toward the entrance to town. Any dastardly sons of a gun would find a swift and easy exit in that way, but they would have to accomplish their business in town before they came, for there was only the entrance near the saloon and the exit on the far side of the building. No chance to think twice about things or double back for another go. But there was no one there. He stopped, crouched and ready, shielding his eyes against the glare that came from the sun filtering in at the end of the alleyway. Surely, they could not have already come and gone. His heart leapt as some unknown thing seemed to warn him, and he spun around. But it was too late. There was the far-off sound of thunder, and then everything went black. Chapter 11. That evening, Carrie heard the hubbub coming from down the street. It filtered in through the open windows, and she straightened up from where she was bent over the kitchen table rolling out pie crust, frowning. Zelma, stirring the pot on the stove and anxiously watching the clock, heard the noise too, and turned to face the window with her eyebrows drawing down over her nose. "Is that?" There was a voice at the window. "Zelma. You'd better come quick." The eyes of two worried women met swiftly. Something was wrong. Jordan had not come back when he usually did, and it was nearly pitch black outside. Had he gotten himself in some trouble? The idea of what kind of trouble the sheriff of Shadow Gulch could get into was enough to strike fear in Carrie's heart. She raced after Zelma, realizing only after she left the house that Aimee, too, was running after them. She knew, in her heart, that she should stop and take the child back to the house, take her to wait in safety until they knew what was going on. But she couldn't do it. Her heart was in her throat, her heart was wherever Jordan Tate was. The thought that something had gone horribly wrong pushed the knowledge through to her. She had fallen in love with the sheriff the very first time that she'd laid eyes on him. But this certainly wasn't the time to think about that. The neighbor who had called for Zelma led the way to the sheriff's station. The front door was standing wide open and there has a half-Scrabble crowd milling both outside and inside, all talking excitedly amongst themselves. Zelma pushed through, and Carrie followed, holding Aimee's hand. At the sight that greeted them, Carrie turned back and picked Aimee up bodily, holding her in her arms with her head pressed to her shoulder. Seated at the sheriff's desk, in Jordan's place, was Mike Chesley, the deputy. The mayor of Shadow Gulch was standing near him, speaking low and urgent, as Mike nodded, his expression grave. There was a man in the cell, spread out on the cot, head lolling. The man was Jordan Tate. It was only with a great force of will that Carrie was able to keep herself from crying out aloud. Jordan was clearly unconscious, and there was a wound high up on his temple that had dripped blood to the ground, pooling in a small puddle that was rapidly turning brown. He looked dirty, unkempt, disheveled, a far cry from the genteel, dapper man she had seen leave after breakfast that morning, not to mention the one that had embraced her just the night before. Zelma's face went white at the sight of her son in a cell, but she advanced on the desk at once. "What is going on?" she demanded. "Why have you jailed the sheriff of Shadow Gulch, and what are you, Mike Chesley, doing in his place?" The two men looked up at her. Carrie was glad to see that, at the very least, they held some respect for Jordan's mother, even though they must have been responsible for Jordan being in this state. "Now, ma'am," said Mike first, "there's a perfectly good reason for everything, and I hope you'll give us a minute to explain before you fly off the handle." "A minute," Zelma said, folding her arms. "No more. And while you're explaining, you can just go and unlock that cell door so I can see what's happened to my son." "That's just it," Mike said. "We can't, not yet." "What are you talking about?" "About an hour ago, there was a disruption at the saloon," Mike said, glancing quickly at the mayor. One of the private rooms, as a matter of fact. I hope I don't have to spell it out to you, ma'am, but the truth is that apparently Jordan caused some trouble and started a fight with another man over one of the girls. He'd been drinking and got the worst of it, and this other fella laid him out and then took off. I reckon it was because he didn't realize he'd cold-cocked the sheriff. Anyhow, the doctor's already been and looked at him, and he's in no real danger, but might have a little concussion. And if the story is true, then he rightly deserves a little time in his own jail cell, put in the mayor. "A little concussion," repeated Zelma scathingly. "Now, you listen to me, Mayor Morrison, and you too, Mike Chesley. You know as well as I do that Jordan Tate has never so much as set foot in the upstairs of the saloon, don't you listen to a word they say, Carrie, and has never so much as thrown a punch that wasn't in the pursuit of justice. Furthermore, it's a blatant lie to suggest that anyone could get the best of him in a fair fight. And I don't care much for any doctor who claims that it's nothing more than a little concussion and can just as well be handled while the patient is bleeding to death in a jail cell. You release him right this instant and have him carried home. I'll take care of him." "Well, ma'am, until we know the truth of what happened." "You can just take my word for it," Zelma snapped. "If that man in there has done any such thing, I'll bring him back and lock him up myself." She was fairly vibrating with anger. Carrie thought, hazily, that the last thing she ever wanted was to make Zelma Tate angry. In her arms, Aimee stirred and drew closer to her. The little girl was shaking, her head turned and her eyes fixed on her father. Carrie held on to her tightly. "I suppose we can allow that," said Mayor Morrison slowly. "But we'll have to investigate once he's alert enough to talk." "I'm sure," Zelma snorted. "And who's going to investigate?" "Someone set up the sheriff. In the interim, of course, we can't allow him to remain as sheriff, not to mention the fact that he's hardly able to do the job, in his current condition. I've named Mr. Chesley here acting sheriff." Zelma looked from one to the other. Carrie had never seen such cold fury in the face of any woman, but Zelma controlled herself. It must have been an effort, the same sort of effort that her son must put forth in the face of injustice. "We'll get to the bottom of this one way or another," she said, deliberately. "Now send Jordan brought home. Now." There was no arguing with that tone of voice, not even by the mayor and newly appointed interim sheriff of Shadow Gulch. In short order, Jordan Tate was back home and in bed, his head carefully cradled on the softest pillows in the house. Carrie tucked the blanket in around him and lingered for a moment, knowing that Zelma and Aimee were in the kitchen. The wound on his temple had been cleaned and bandaged, and she slipped her fingertips lightly over the edges of the white bandage, brushing aside his hair. At the feeling of her touch, his eyes opened and fixed on hers, clear as crystal and lucid as black coffee. "Jordan," she whispered. "What happened?" He closed his eyes and swallowed with difficulty. "Tact," he murmured. "You were attacked? By whom?" But when he opened his eyes again, the lucidity was rapidly disappearing into the swirling clouds of pain and exhaustion. With an effort, he focused on her. "Sweet," he whispered. The rest of whatever he had tried to say never came. He closed his eyes again, and soon the deeper rise and fall of his chest bespoke the fact that he was sleeping soundly. She fought back a long-delayed sob and leaned forward to press a careful kiss to his forehead. Then she had to leave him. There were other things to be done. His mother to speak with, his daughter to calm and soothe, his house to care for. She had all the responsibilities of a wife and a mother and a daughter-in-law, without any of the love and affection and protection that she could rightly expect in that position. When her mother had told her that she was going to marry Jordan Tate, she never would have imagined any of this. She stopped just outside his door, feeling momentarily unable to take another step. Slipping down to sit with her back against the door, she pressed her hands over her face and fell into the deepest weeping she had experienced since the day they had laid Adelaide Smith Martin to rest. Chapter 12. Jordan slept for longer than he could remember. When he awoke, the sun was bright. But it had been dark when he'd fallen asleep, hadn't it? Had he slept the day away? Or had he gone to bed as usual at night, and overslept the next morning? Was he at home? He didn't remember coming home. He lay awake for a few moments, muzzily thinking through what he could recall, which was precious little. But a certain detail kept coming to mind again and again, and he blinked in the light as he tried to figure out why it might be so important. Mike, something about Mike. His mother bustled in with a breakfast tray and gave a smile of pure joy to see her son awake and alert. "It's about time you stopped lollygagging around," she said, setting the tray down and taking a seat on the bed beside him. She put a careful hand to his forehead. "How do you feel?" "Confused more than anything." "What happened?" In concise sentences, she explained the circumstances of how he had been found, jailed, and then brought home to be nursed. Though her manner was brusque, he could tell that a strong strain of worry ran just beneath the surface and put a hand on hers as she finished up. "It isn't true," he said. "I know it isn't. But, I don't know what is true. I can't seem to remember." She watched him for a moment, and then smoothed a hand over his forehead. "Don't frown, dear, you'll give yourself a headache. Just lie here and rest. There'll be plenty of time to get things sorted out when you're feeling better." He opened his mouth to object, then thought better of it. If he tried to insist that he needed to fulfill his obligation as sheriff, she would only push back harder. If he tried to leave, she would lock him in his room. He certainly had inherited that stubbornness from somewhere, and it hadn't been from his father. Instead, he waited patiently while she left the tray for him and went out of the room. Then he was up, as quickly as he dared, fighting off a few waves of dizziness that threatened to swamp him as he fumbled for his trousers and shirt. The tin sheriff's star was nowhere to be seen and he felt a strange moment of panic, then realized that, of course, Mike must have it. Mike had been named sheriff, after all. There was something about Mike, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. His pocket watch told him that it was about 4 in the afternoon, the next day after his little misadventure. Mike had been sheriff for just under 24 hours. He'd been deputy for years before that. How strange it must be for him to see such a sudden elevation in status after having been waiting in the wings all this time. Something about Mike. His family was waiting for him downstairs. His mother, his daughter, and Carrie. Carrie, his, something. Something about Mike. He needed a name for her. The only word he could think of was sweetheart, and it didn't seem quite right. Not enough, somehow. Not enough for the surge of love and heat that he felt whenever he thought of her. How could he have ever chastised himself for wanting her? It was the most natural thing in the world. This blow to the head had shown him what was really important: family and love. Not just justice, more than that. He hadn't been able to save Sarah, and maybe he had no right to bring Carrie into a position where she, too, might be in danger. But in this moment, he was sure that if it came down to the women in his life versus any crooks out there, he would bet on the women. His mother, Carrie, Aimee. Even Sarah. She had triumphed, in the end. Brought low at the end of her life, she lived on through her daughter Aimee, the brightest spark. The bright, sudden flare of a match lit in the dark, of the sunlight at the end of the alleyway. Something was wrong with Mike. The events of the evening before crashed over him with a clarity that was almost startling, that almost took his breath away. He stumbled back against the bed and hung on for a moment, catching his breath. Then he began to move. He had to do it now, before anything worse happened. He had to go after the bad guys before there was another tragedy. Chapter 13. The erstwhile sheriff of Shadow Gulch crashed into the office of the mayor of the same town. The two responsible men stared at each other. Neither much cared for the other, neither much trusted the other. But this was the time to put all that to rest, the time to put integrity on the line. It would help, Jordan thought, if the room wasn't gently spinning. Mayor Morrison stood up at his desk, leaning onto the surface with his palms flat. "Well, now," he said. "To what do I owe the dubious pleasure?" Jordan strode forward, or, at least, he tried to stride forward, though his footsteps faltered somewhat. "You put Mike Chesley in charge of the town." Morrison nodded. "I did. The previous sheriff appeared to be unfit." "It was a mistake," Jordan said shortly. Morrison raised his eyebrows. "Is that so?" "Yes." "I suppose you expect me to reinstate you immediately, simply based on your say-so?" "No," said Jordan. "I expect you to go with me to Mike's house, now, and look for evidence that he's been working with a gang, maybe the one that rode into town a while back, the one that you heard was headed for Wyoming." Morrison tilted his head curiously. "Why do you expect that I would do a thing like that?" "Because," said Jordan patiently, "when I got knocked out last night, it was because of what Mike told me. He sent me into the alleyway, saying that he saw the gang waiting there. Well, maybe they were. Next thing I remember, I'm waking up in bed with a headache the size of Texas and Mike Chesley is sheriff of Shadow Gulch. That sounds a little suspicious, doesn't it?" He could tell that his words had made an impact on Morrison, but the man wasn't entirely convinced. "Suspicious, maybe," he allowed. "But that doesn't mean he's working with any gang. Maybe he's just watching out for things." "Would you arrest a man for that?" "How stupid would he have to be to try to trick his way into being sheriff, knowing that I'd just wake up and say what happened?" "Never underestimate the capacity of some men for stupidity," Morrison cautioned him. Jordan sighed. His head throbbed. All right. You're right there. But you don't know Mike, and you don't know this town. He's been a deputy for years. Why would he suddenly decide he was tired of it, and trick his way into being sheriff?" Morrison shrugged. "Why not?" Jordan glared at him. "You certainly aren't making this easy." "It's not my job to make things easy. You're the sheriff. You barge in here, when you should by rights be recovering in bed, if not locked up in jail. You cast aspersions on the character of your former deputy. I could think it's the head wound. I could think it's jealousy. I could think it's because of your desire to hide the truth from getting out, that the story about you is true. You make it a little easier for me, Sheriff. Why should I believe you?" Jordan sighed and put a hand to his head. "I don't know why," he said. "I don't know what to say. I only know that I've never lied to you, not once in the few months we've known each other, and for a certainty Mike has. At the very least, he's lied to you. As for the rest of it, I have only my gut instinct. And it tells me that something's wrong." Morrison watched him closely, nodding. Suddenly the hint of a smile flickered over his thin lips. "Well, a sheriff's gut instinct is good enough for me," he said. "You'll have to tell me where our good deputy lives." Jordan boggled at him. Well, all right. Yes. Of course. Yes, gosh, I hardly expected you to give in so easily. Just one question before we go, Sheriff Tate. Jordan paused, though holding still was one of the hardest things he had ever done. Why did you decide to trust me? Morrison questioned softly. Jordan grinned, feeling a strong sense of relief. I guess I figured, what choice do I have, he said. If I hadn't been knocked unconscious, if I could see straight, I wouldn't have come to you at all. You need my help. Jordan nodded. I guess I do, he said. I guess it's no good being the sheriff and having everyone rely on you if you're too stubborn and prideful to admit when you need an extra pair of hands. The mayor nodded, looking at him thoughtfully. Then, with the quiet deliberation that marked all his movements, he stood and retrieved a pair of pistols from the desk drawer, along with a small folder containing a piece of paper. As a matter of fact, you made the right choice, he said. My credentials. Jordan read over the page, then read over it again. Eyes wide, he looked up at Morrison. You're a U.S. Marshal? Morrison nodded, strapping on his pistols. I am. I've been undercover for 6 months now, looking for a lead on the Snyder gang. We heard they were headed this way. The way they operate, they move into a town and take it over, work it till it's bare. I reckon they tried that with Shadow Gulch. The raid was probably them testing the waters. Maybe they heard that the sheriff of Shadow Gulch wasn't about to let anyone in. But maybe they found fertile soil in Mike Chesley. Jordan nodded. He could scarcely wrap his mind around the fact that Morrison, whom he so disliked, was actually a marshal. But the paper looked legitimate, and Morrison's manner, so spare and deliberate, was certainly marshal-like, if not particularly likable. He swallowed and touched the butt of his gun to ensure that it was in place. What do we do, then, Marshal Morrison? Well, Sheriff Tate, said Morrison, allowing a faint and rare smile to cross his lips, what do you say to going to get the bad guys, serve a little justice? Jordan Tate grinned. I thought you'd never ask. Chapter 14. Carrie Smith heard shots ringing through the clear summer air, and her heart stopped cold in her chest. She looked over to Zelma, who met her gaze with just as much acute fear. Jordan, Zelma whispered. They were both up and moving without another word spoken, leaving Aimee crying after them for an explanation of what was going on. Zelma scrambled for the stairs, running up as quickly as she could, calling for Jordan. But Carrie had a horrid feeling in the pit of her stomach, and she was already fumbling her laces tied and reaching for the doorknob of the front entrance when she heard Zelma call down the stairs, Carrie, he isn't there. He isn't there. Carrie was out the door and down the steps, feet racing as fast as her heart, out onto the street. The town center was to the left, the edge of town to the right. She hesitated, unsure, wondering which way she should run. Then, the unwanted answer to her unspoken question, more gunshots, from the right. She turned without thinking and ran in that direction. There weren't many houses out here on the edge of town. The home belonging to the sheriff of Shadow Gulch was one of the biggest, the rest were small and progressively run down. She had never noticed much about them before, because when she went for walks with Aimee they'd always gone toward town. She didn't notice much about them today, either. All she knew was that she was flying, running faster than she ever had, and the gunshots and the sound of shouting was still going on and getting closer. She couldn't make out the words, but she could tell that it was the shouting of men. 2 groups, one outside, one inside. If she could just get closer, just find Jordan. Her heart was in her mouth, her breath stabbing at her lungs with each inhalation, and suddenly she heard someone call her name. He came out from an alleyway and nearly canonied into her, arresting her in her haphazard flight and pulling her into his arms. She pushed him away at first until she got a good view of who had caught her up, and then she pressed into him even harder. Jordan. His breath puffed out into her hair, halfway a chuckle, halfway a sigh of relief. Carrie, let's get one thing straight, my girl. Never ever run toward the sound of gunfire. She registered, dimly, that he was kissing her hair. She sighed deeply and stepped back from him, turning to look in the direction of all the hubbub. But things were calming down a bit now. There were no more gunshots, though there was still some shouting. And in the distance, she saw the door to a small house open, and a curtailed parade of men emerged one by one, hands on their heads. "Jordan, what on earth?" "It's Mike, poor fellow," he explained. "Mike Chesley, my deputy. He turned out to be working with a gang, the Snyder gang, as a matter of fact, though I don't think it will mean much to you." "It doesn't mean much to me, come to that. They bought him off and came up with a scheme to get me out of the way so he could become sheriff of Shadow Gulch. They figured if he was sheriff, they'd have free reign in the town, but they didn't reckon on our esteemed mayor. Mayor Morrison? But I know, he waved a hand at her. He's the one that put Mike in charge." "Well, he didn't know. It took some explanation. But he believed me, thank goodness, and we were able to raid the house and apprehend the gang before they started their reign of terror." "Oh, Jordan." She clung to him again, realizing suddenly how terrible had been the danger that he was in. "They could have shot you. You could have been killed. And so could you, rushing into the middle of a firefight like that," he reminded her gently. "So let's just make a deal here and now. As long as we're married, neither of us will ever act as rashly as we've both acted today. I'll always let you know what I'm doing, and you will always let me know before you decide to rush in and save me." He squeezed her in his arms. "Deal?" "Of course," but his words suddenly caught up with her and she turned wide eyes on him. "As long as we're married?" "I hope you didn't forget," said Jordan Tate, "but your mother and my mother had an agreement. I'm sure they'd be disappointed if we didn't follow through on it." She had no words. She had only actions. Winding her arms about his neck, she pushed up onto her toes and pressed a kiss to his lips. For a long moment they stood like that together, while the wheels of justice continued to turn not far away. Finally, she dropped down to her feet again, sighing in contentment, and pressed her cheek to his chest where the tin star belonged. "When my mother told me that I was going to marry the sheriff of Shadow Gulch," she murmured, "I never realized exactly what that would entail." Jordan Tate smiled and stroked her hair lovingly. "Darling," he said, "you haven't even seen the half of it." The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susanna Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susanna Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susanna Calloway Western romance.